joke that put ESPN in a trap. One joke, one halftime desk, one viral clip, and suddenly, Charles Barkley was not just talking about basketball anymore. He was daring one of the biggest sports networks in America to make the most expensive mistake of its year. It happened during the NBA Finals, under the brightest lights in the sport, when every camera angle, every facial expression, and every loose sentence could explode across the internet before the next commercial break. The Inside the NBA crew was supposed to be breaking down the game, feeding the energy, and keeping the finals moving. But when the conversation drifted toward Cardi B's halftime presence, Barkley did what Barkley has built an entire television career doing. He said the thing most broadcasters would never risk saying out loud. The desk laughed. The moment moved fast. On television, it lasted only seconds. Online, it became a firestorm. Within minutes, clips were flying across social media. Some fans called it classic Chuck, unfiltered, reckless, funny, and impossible to control. Others said the joke felt out of place on a polished ESPN broadcast, especially during the biggest NBA stage of the season. But the real shock did not come from the joke itself. The real shock came later, when Barkley was asked if ESPN had pulled him aside, warned him, or told him he had gone too far. That was when Barkley flipped the entire story upside down. Instead of apologizing, instead of playing defense, instead of acting like a man afraid for his job, he said the quiet part loud. He basically told ESPN to fire him. Not because he was scared, not because he was desperate, but because, in his mind, getting fired might be the best financial outcome on the table. That is what makes this story different from a normal sports media controversy. This is not just about a joke. This is about leverage. A giant contract, a legendary broadcaster, a network that needs his star power, and a man who seems to know that the punishment ESPN could use against almost anyone else might actually become his reward. So now the real question is not whether Charles Barkley crossed a line, the real question is whether ESPN has any power over him at all. Before we go deeper, hit subscribe if you follow NBA drama, media battles, and the stories behind the game. And comment where you are watching from. If you think Barkley is untouchable, press 1. If you think ESPN should finally control him, press 2. How a halftime moment became a national debate? The strange part about the whole Barkley storm is how ordinary it looked in the moment. This was not a press conference meltdown. This was not a screaming match. This was not some carefully prepared attack on ESPN, Cardi B, or the league. It started the way so many Charles Barkley moments start, with a loose comment at the desk, a few laughs, and a broadcast trying to keep moving. Game 3 of the NBA Finals had already carried enough drama on its own. The Knicks and Spurs were locked in the kind of series that makes every possession feel heavier than the last. Madison Square Garden was loud. The cameras were everywhere. And halftime had turned into a show inside the show. Cardi B was part of that spectacle, pulling attention away from the analysts before they even had a chance to settle into their usual rhythm. That is when Barkley leaned into the moment. He joked that the crew had been competing with Cardi B for attention and admitted they had lost. It was a classic Barkley setup, self-deprecating on the surface, but dangerous enough that everyone at the desk knew another line might be coming. And then it came. The co-hosts reacted the way they often do around him. Shaq and Kenny understood the rhythm. They knew when Chuck was joking, when he was baiting, and when he was about to create a clip that would live far beyond the broadcast. One of them pushed back quickly, almost like he was trying to put a safety rail around the moment before it rolled downhill. Barkley smiled it off, acting as if he had no idea who had said what. But in the modern NBA media world, a few seconds is more than enough. Before the game even cooled down, the clip had escaped the broadcast and entered the internet machine. On one side were fans laughing, saying this was exactly why Barkley still mattered. On the other side were people asking why ESPN, a network with a more controlled image than TNT, would allow that kind of line on its biggest stage. And that is where the real tension began. Because this was no longer just a joke about a halftime performance. It became a test of whether the wildest voice from the TNT era could survive inside ESPN's more corporate machine. Why? The internet split in half. The internet did what it always does when Charles Barkley says something risky. It split the room instantly. One side saw the clip and shrugged. To them, this was Chuck being Chuck. This was the same unpredictable energy that made Inside the NBA feel alive for more than 2 decades. They did not tune in to hear perfect corporate language. They tuned in because Barkley might say something messy, funny, blunt, or uncomfortable before anyone had time to stop him. That danger is part of the product. For those fans, the outrage felt exaggerated. They argued that Barkley was not trying to start a war. He was not launching a serious attack. He was riffing in real time during a halftime show, doing exactly what made him famous. To them, the moment only proved that ESPN had finally inherited the one thing it could never fully sanitize: Chuck's mouth. But another group saw the same clip differently. They argued that the finals are not a late-night bar conversation. This was ESPN and ABC, national television, a massive audience, and a performer being turned into the center of a joke. To that side, the issue is not whether Barkley had always been like this. The issue was whether that style still fits the current media climate. That tension is what made the story travel. It was not only about Cardi B. It was about two different eras of sports television crashing into each other. The old school audience values personality, looseness, and the feeling that anything can happen. The newer media environment demands caution, context, and awareness that every sentence can be clipped, judged, and replayed without the laughter that originally surrounded it. Barkley lives in the first world, ESPN operates in the second, and that is why the story had power. Because the clip forced everyone to ask the same question: can a broadcaster who built his career on being impossible to control still exist inside a network that survives by controlling everything? For most people, that would be a dangerous question. For Barkley, it almost seemed like an invitation. Barkley walks into the fire. The controversy might have faded if Charles Barkley had done what most television personalities do after a viral moment. He could have softened it. He could have said the joke came out wrong. He could have claimed he respected everyone involved and wanted to move forward. That would have been the normal playbook. But Barkley has never made a career out of following the normal playbook. When he appeared on the Dan Patrick Show, the question was simple. Had anyone at the network spoken to him? Had management pulled him aside? Had someone told him there were lines he could not cross now that Inside the NBA was airing under the ESPN and ABC umbrella? That was the moment when most broadcasters would carefully choose every word. Barkley did the opposite. He made it clear that he was not afraid of being disciplined. In fact, he sounded almost amused by the idea. Then he said the line that turned a viral joke into a full sports media earthquake. He openly suggested that he would love to be fired if it meant the network still had to pay him for the years remaining on his deal. That was not damage control. That was gasoline. Suddenly, the story was no longer about whether a joke had gone too far. It became about whether Barkley was daring ESPN to make a move, and more importantly, whether ESPN could afford to make one. That is the genius and the danger of Barkley's position. He was not speaking like a man begging to keep a job. He was speaking like a man who had already studied the contract, understood the leverage, and realized the worst punishment might actually benefit him. Every sentence made ESPN's silence louder. If they punished him, they risked, proving he still controlled the story. If they ignored him, they risked looking powerless. And if they fired him, they might be giving him exactly what he wanted. Barkley did not walk away from the fire. He walked straight into it, smiled, and made the network decide whether it wanted to burn money just to prove a point. The contract that changed everything. To understand why Barkley sounded so fearless, you have to follow the money. Because in this story, the money is not a side detail. The money is the entire engine. Barkley's long-term deal was not just another television contract. It was the kind of agreement that changes the balance of power between talent and network. When a broadcaster has years left on a massive guaranteed deal, the normal fear of being fired starts to disappear. The company may still have the title, the studio, the cameras, and the schedule, but the talent has something just as powerful: financial protection. That is why Barkley's comments landed so differently. A young analyst trying to survive at ESPN could never say what he said. A replaceable studio voice would be finished before the next segment. But Barkley is not replaceable in any simple way. He is not just a former player. He is not just an analyst. He is a ratings magnet, a cultural figure, and the personality around whom Inside the NBA built its entire identity. So when he talked about wanting to be fired, it did not sound like a breakdown. It sounded like a calculation. His logic was brutally simple. He has years left. He does not want to work forever. If the deal is structured in a way that protects him, then a firing could mean getting paid without grinding through the rest of the contract. What would terrify another broadcaster becomes, for him, a possible exit ramp. That is the part that makes ESPN's position so uncomfortable. Discipline only works when the punishment hurts the person receiving it. But Barkley publicly suggested that the punishment might be the prize. That flips the entire employer-employee relationship upside down. And he did not hide behind vague language. He laughed about the years left. He talked about the money. He let the audience understand the math. That kind of transparency is rare in sports media because most people protect contract details like state secrets. Barkley treated his contract like a weapon sitting on the desk in plain sight. Once fans understood that, the story became bigger than one joke. It became a power struggle between a network trying to manage risk and a superstar broadcaster who knew exactly how expensive he would be to remove. Why ESPN could not simply pull the plug. The next layer makes the situation even more complicated because Barkley is not a normal ESPN employee in the way many fans assume. For more than 2 decades, Inside the NBA belonged to TNT. That show had its own rhythm, its own culture, and its own freedom. Ernie Johnson, Kenny Smith, Shaquille O'Neal, and Charles Barkley were not just sitting behind a desk, they were the identity of an entire era of NBA television. The jokes, arguments, awkward silences, and unpredictable reactions were not accidents. They were the reason people watched. When the NBA media rights shifted and Inside the NBA found its way onto ESPN and ABC, the arrangement was not as simple as ESPN hiring the whole crew and putting them under its normal system. The show still carried the DNA of TNT and Warner Brothers Discovery. The production structure, the relationships, and the talent situation created a strange hybrid. ESPN had the platform, but it did not fully own the personalities in the same way it controls its in-house voices. That difference mattered. A normal ESPN analyst can be called into a meeting, warned, suspended, or removed through the company's internal process. Barkley's situation is much more tangled. He comes with the show ESPN wanted because the show already had value. But the value of the show comes from the very thing that makes ESPN nervous: its lack of polish. So ESPN faces a brutal trade-off. If the network wants the magic of Inside the NBA, it has to accept some of the chaos. If it tries to remove the chaos, it risks destroying the product it paid to showcase. That is why the word ban always felt too simple. A ban sounds clean. It sounds like a boss making a decision and an employee suffering the consequence. But nothing about this arrangement is clean. ESPN can control airtime, it can control placement, it can shape the broader broadcast. But reaching into the middle of that licensed ecosystem and trying to discipline Barkley directly is not as easy as angry viewers might imagine. And Barkley knows that too. That knowledge is part of his confidence. He understands he is not standing alone as a random voice on a panel. He is tied to a legendary show, a complicated deal, and a network that needs him almost as much as it fears him. That is not normal job security. That is leverage dressed up as entertainment. This was never just about Cardi B. The reason Barkley's "fire me" comment felt so explosive is that it was not new. It was part of a pattern. Charles Barkley has spent his entire television career building a brand around saying what others avoid. He has criticized players, challenged coaches, mocked front offices, called out superstars, and even taken shots at media personalities while sitting inside the media machine himself. That is why fans believe him when he sounds reckless. The recklessness is not an accident. It is the business model. Long before the Cardi B clip became a trending topic, Barkley had already been speaking like a man who did not fear ESPN's authority. He had complained about schedules. He had mocked the idea of being spread across too many programs. He had made it clear that he was not interested in being used like a normal network employee. Most broadcasters negotiate those frustrations behind closed doors. Barkley said them out loud. That matters because it proves this moment was not some sudden emotional collapse. It was the latest episode in a long-running story about independence. Barkley has always been at his strongest when he sounds like the last person in the room who cannot be bought, trained, or scared into reading from a script. Fans may disagree with him. Players may get angry at him. Networks may get headaches from him. But the audience understands one thing. He is going to say what he thinks, and then he is going to live with the reaction. That is why the Cardi B joke became so dangerous for ESPN. The network was not dealing with a one-time slip from someone who could easily be corrected. It was dealing with the personality whose entire value comes from the possibility that he might say the wrong thing at the wrong time. And that creates the impossible question. How do you control someone because he is uncontrolled, when the reason you hired the show is because viewers love that he is uncontrolled? That is the trap Barkley represents. He is both the risk and the reward. He is the reason the segment can go viral for all the right reasons, and also the reason it can go viral for the wrong ones. ESPN did not just inherit a broadcaster. It inherited a force of nature with a microphone. The reaction was loud, but not fatal. For all the noise around the controversy, the reaction never became the kind of unified outrage that forces a network's hand. That is an important distinction. A viral backlash can look massive from the outside because the loudest clips, comments, and posts keep repeating across platforms. But networks do not respond only to volume. They respond to risk. They look at whether sponsors are panicking, whether the league is upset, whether talent relationships are breaking, and whether the story has moved from online argument to institutional pressure. In Barkley's case, the reaction was intense but divided. Many fans laughed. Some defended him instantly, saying the joke was exactly what they expected from Chuck. Others criticized it, calling it outdated or unnecessary. Media outlets wrote about the controversy, but much of the coverage focused less on punishment and more on the absurdity of Barkley daring ESPN to fire him while holding a huge deal. That framing helped him. It shifted the story away from outrage and towards spectacle. Even the Dan Patrick interview did not feel like a courtroom. It felt more like Barkley being given space to explain how little fear he had. That tone mattered. If the sports media world had treated him as someone in serious professional danger, the story might have built in another direction. Instead, the dominant energy became amusement, disbelief, and fascination with the contract. The presence of Cardi B also shaped the reaction. Reports and online chatter did not show her leading a major public push for consequences. Without the person at the center of the joke demanding action, the pressure on ESPN lost some force. Fans could argue with each other endlessly, but there was no clear final blow forcing the network into a public punishment. Meanwhile, Barkley's own crew did not appear fractured. Shaq and Kenny, reacting with laughter, signaled that inside the chemistry of the show, this was treated as another chaotic Chuck moment rather than a disaster. That kind of internal comfort makes it harder for a network to claim the entire broadcast had been damaged beyond repair. So the storm kept spinning, but it never became fatal. It created headlines, clips, reactions, and debate. What it did not create was a clean reason for ESPN to risk a massive fight with one of the most valuable personalities in sports television. Was Charles Barkley really banned? Now we reach the question that made the whole story clickable. Was Charles Barkley actually banned by ESPN? Based on what was publicly shown in the story, the answer is no. There was no clear suspension, no official statement saying he had been pulled from the air, no confirmed disciplinary action, no public announcement that ESPN had banned, benched, or removed him because of the Cardi B joke. What existed was a viral headline shape, the kind that takes a messy media moment and turns it into a dramatic punishment before the punishment ever happened. That difference mattered. A controversy is not the same thing as a ban. A backlash is not the same thing as discipline. A broadcaster saying he hopes to be fired is not proof that he has been fired. In fact, the most interesting part of this whole situation is that ESPN appeared to do the one thing Barkley could not turn into a victory. Nothing. Doing nothing may sound weak, but in this case it may have been strategic. If ESPN fired him, Barkley could claim he forced their hand and possibly walked away with a financial win. If ESPN suspended him, the network could have created an even bigger story and invited every sports show in America to debate whether it had overreacted. If ESPN publicly scolded him, Barkley might have used the next microphone to make the situation worse. Silence gave the story less oxygen. That does not mean ESPN loved the moment. No major network enjoys seeing one of its biggest personalities become the center of a controversy during the final, but networks often choose the least damaging option, not the most emotionally satisfying one. And in this case, the least damaging option was to let the viral cycle burn hot, cool down, and move on. That is why the banned for real angle falls apart when you look closely. It sounds dramatic, but the structure does not support it. Barkley was not shown being crushed by ESPN's power. If anything, the story showed how limited that power might be when the talent is famous enough, expensive enough, and valuable enough to make punishment feel like self-sabotage. So no, the real story is not that ESPN banned Barkley. The real story is that Barkley dared ESPN to do it, and ESPN blinked by refusing to play his game. The lesson behind Barkley's power play. The final lesson of this story is bigger than Charles Barkley, bigger than Cardi B, and bigger than one viral finals clip. It is a lesson about modern sports media, personal power, and what happens when a network builds its product around a personality it cannot fully control. Barkley's strength has always been authenticity. That word gets overused, but in his case it fits. He does not sound like a polished brand manager. He sounds like a former superstar sitting at the desk saying whatever comes to his mind before the room has time to filter it. That is why fans trust him even when they disagree with him. They believe they are getting the real Chuck, not a version approved by a committee. But authenticity has a cost. The same freedom that makes someone electric can also make them risky. A loose sentence can become a headline. A joke can become a debate. A few seconds of television can become a week of arguments about respect, taste, money, contracts, and control. For ESPN, the smartest move may have been restraint. Not every controversy needs a public punishment. Sometimes the most strategic response is to avoid feeding the fire, especially when the person at the center of the fire seems ready to profit from the explosion. Barkley wanted the network to react emotionally. ESPN's best answer was to refuse. For Barkley, the lesson is also clear. Power is not only about money, but money gives freedom. His contract gave him the confidence to speak in a way most broadcasters never could. His reputation gave him protection. His value to the show made him difficult to replace. Together, those forces turned him from employee into institution. But there is a human lesson here too. Words still matter. Comedy, honesty, and entertainment can bring people together, but they can also divide people when the moment lands differently across generations. The best voices in media understand that freedom is strongest when it is paired with awareness. Being fearless does not always mean being careless, and being powerful does not mean every line is worth crossing. In the end, Barkley was not banned. He was not silenced. He simply reminded the sports world that in today's NBA media business, the loudest person is not always the one with the most power. Sometimes the most powerful person is the one who knows exactly what everyone else would lose by trying to shut him down. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit subscribe for more NBA drama, media battles, and stories behind the headlines. Like the video, share it with another NBA fan, and comment your take below. Press 1 if you think Barkley played this perfectly. Press 2 if you think ESPN should draw a harder line.